From Bloomberg News and iHeartRadio, it's The Big Take. I'm Wes Kosova. Today, more people are working from home, and that has some cities very nervous. We've talked a few times on this podcast about the tug of war between companies and employees over flexible work arrangements. People whose jobs don't require them to be there in person want to work from home at least part of the time, and a lot of companies are letting them. That's left cities with this pressing problem. Fewer people downtown means a lot less money being spent there every day. There's less demand for all the buildings and buses, shops, restaurants, and services that downtowns are built around and can't survive without. Companies, politicians, urban planners are now taking a hard look at how their cities can change to adapt to a new reality. Reporters Emma Court and Donna Borak have written a big story about what all this looks like for New York and other cities too. And they're here with me now from New York. Donna, let me start with you. When you began reporting this story, what is it that you wanted to find out?
When we began this reporting project, we wanted to be able to answer the question of what was the economic impact of remote work in Manhattan, right? And we wanted to be able to show in more tangible, concrete ways how the daily rhythm of life had changed across the city. We know that ridership is down. We know that people are not badging into the office nearly as often as pre-pandemic. You go downtown, it's not nearly as vibrant, as it once was. But what does it really feel like on a Monday in Manhattan versus a Thursday? And does it really matter?
You do see this sort of clumping around Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday in New York City. People are in the office, and we've seen that. We used a ton of data for the story. So we saw this trend pretty black and white in a variety of ways. We saw it in black car data. So for people who are expensing business rides to work, we saw them sort of coming in force on Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. We saw it in subway data. We saw it in office badge data. We see it in foot traffic data. And so I think, we feel really confident after looking at all this data and really crunching the numbers to be able to say this is a big trend that's happening. People are all wringing their hands about hybrid work, but the reality of it is, at least in New York and in many parts of the country, people are back in offices, but it's extremely uneven, especially at the start and the end of the week. And, we have to think about what that means for cities, for their economies, for offices, for workers. That does have economic effects, and, cities are only beginning to sort of grapple with what that means for them.
Sure. We're even seeing this at Sweetgreen and Chopped.
The popular lunch places where you get a salad or something.
Exactly, right? Even just standing in line, you're overhearing people talk about, well, what's your 3-day? When are you coming in? Are you coming in on Tuesdays? Is Monday your anchor day? And so we did a little bit of an experiment to find out just how long it would take, right, to get a Sweetgreen salad on a Monday versus a peak day of Wednesday or Thursday.
I and one of our interns at the time, Christian, went to one specific Sweetgreen over the course of a week and came up with this very scientific methodology, which is get online by a certain time, I think it was 12:10 p.m., and then see how long it takes to get from this, getting in line to picking up your salad. And so on a Monday, it was about 9 minutes and 20 seconds. It was a little longer on a Tuesday, 9 minutes and almost 40 seconds. Wednesday, a whopping 13 plus minutes. Thursday, actually a lot shorter, about 6 minutes. And then Friday, it was just 4 minutes. And I think, this kind of speaks to if you are, so bold as to go into an office on a Friday, you will see there are no lines for lunch. Your subway car is not going to be busy. And you kind of reap the benefits of that. But the businesses around you and the other kind of systems reliant on commuters certainly don't. Some of this kind of gets at, I think, what the heart of the story is really, which is, there's been a lot of hand-wringing about what does it all mean, right? People are not in offices the way they used to be. Why does this matter? A couple of, I think, insights that we bring to the table that hasn't been sort of sharply looked at before is, one, this difference by day of week, which I think everyone is observing if they're in the office in a big city. And then two, sort of like, what is the cost of that? And we were able to come up with a number to sort of figure out how much this is costing New York City, or specifically Manhattan, in terms of, sales to businesses like Sweetgreen that the sort of weekday warriors favor, right? And, to transit systems because there's like missed fares, for instance, and all these other, knock-on effects of me working from home on a Friday. It doesn't seem so bad, but in mass and aggregate, that really adds up.
Our reporting and analysis showed that worker spending has reduced by at least $12.4 billion a year in Manhattan alone due to remote work.
Donna, in your story, you write that to get that number, you asked for help from a professor. His name is Jose Maria Barrero, and he is at Mexico's Instituto Tecnológico Autónomo. And he's also part of Stanford University's Work from Home Research Group. So how does he calculate this?
In 2020, Barrero and his colleagues had asked in their survey, as part of their work from home research, what workers had estimated they were spending on a weekly basis on meals, shopping, and entertainment near the workplace a year prior. So this research really was closest to get a sense of what were people spending pre-pandemic. Using that number, he was able to show how much less workers were spending by adjusting for a 30% reduction in return to office. That ends up translating to about $4,661 per person per year in Manhattan. They calculated similar analysis in other major cities, including San Francisco, which was just over $3,000 a year per worker that was being lost due to remote work, and in a city like Chicago, just a little over $2,300.
So we came up with this number for New York. But what's cool about, what Jose has done and his colleagues at WFH Research Group is that they also came up with all these estimates for how much in-person work has been reduced in all these other cities in the United States. And they came up with spending calculations, similarly per person per week reductions in spending for all these different places. So I was really interested to see this list because at the top of it is actually, it's not New York, it's Washington, D.C., interestingly, with a 37% reduction in in-person days.
And that's probably because you have all these federal workers who have lenient work-from-home policies. And in fact, the mayor of Washington, D.C., Muriel Bowser, has been kind of begging the Biden administration to require federal employees to get back to work so that they can make up the lost money.
Exactly. And in fact, in New York, Mayor Eric Adams has been a huge proponent of in-person work. He's, has federal employees in the office, depending on their jobs, obviously, during the week. And it's been a big issue because people don't really want to be in 5 days a week the way they were used to before. So yeah, DC at the top of the list, followed by Atlanta at number 2. Number 3 is Phoenix. Number 4 is LA. New York City coming in at number 5, but it's very similar to LA with a 33% reduction in in-person days. Then San Francisco, Boston, Miami, Chicago, Dallas, Philly, Houston.
And so we're seeing this happening all over the country where cities are taking big hits because people aren't coming downtown as much.
Yeah, and we're seeing it all over the world, in fact. But, their data was pretty U.S. specific. So we also have the spending reductions. And even though New York is only sort of number 5 in terms of reduction in in-person days, it's number 1 in terms of spending because New York's expensive. So New York is at the top of the list with a reduction of $4,661 per person per year. LA is $4,200. DC is closer to about $4,000. Atlanta is $3,900, and so on. But we thought it was a really interesting kind of window into sort of how cities are getting impacted by this trend and, how big a hit they're taking.
There is a so what to all of this, right? They have ripple effects of causing a decline in consumption of food and beverages, right? Transit rides, impacting small business owners, lowering sales tax revenue, transit operating revenue, which we're clearly seeing in New York with the MTA shortfall. And those drop-offs have been especially acute, as our reporting has showed, on Mondays and Fridays, right, when employees have shown the strongest preference to work from home. And so cities really have to figure this out. The importance of these revenue sources varies from city to city. in some cases for cities and regions, the losses are so urgent and are just requiring immediate fiscal help in the very near term. And even if you look at New York City, Mayor Eric Adams rolled out his $103 billion budget and is already projecting tax revenue shortfalls in the out years. Like, yes, we can balance this year, but there's going to be a lagging effect to the impact of all of this.
So all that money has to go somewhere. It's not that people aren't spending at all anymore. They're just spending closer to home when they work from home. And so we are seeing, MasterCard has this really cool kind of data, and it measures in-store and online retail sales across all forms of payment. So this is literally New York City spending data that they have, which is such a cool data source we found. And what we saw in their data is that, Manhattan growth in 2022, like in certain months like September versus 2019, that retail sales was growing, a little bit, but not a lot. And then you saw in the outer boroughs higher levels of growth relative to 2019 versus in Manhattan. And I think that tells us, we don't know obviously exactly what's going on, but we were looking at weekdays. And so we believe what's happening is that, work from home is providing an economic benefit in these other parts of the city.
Emma and Donna, please stay with me. We'll continue talking after the break. Donna, Emma, you've painted this very vivid picture of how cities are being affected by workers not coming into the office as much on certain days. So the big question now is, what are cities actually doing about it? You have businesses affected, mass transit, you have lots of office buildings that are standing empty or underused part of the week. How has this affected cities, and why is it so important to cities?
Cities really care about this because, for one thing, they use, tax revenue from consumer spending to fund the city. They also care about it because another big form of revenue for cities is income taxes. And if I don't have to live in New York City because I only have to be in the office one time a week and I can, take the hit of a 2-hour commute from some other state, maybe I'm going to move away. And in a city that's as expensive and difficult to live in as New York, and many cities are expensive and difficult to live in, that is a big existential risk. What is the point of living in New York City if you don't really have to live there and you're paying a big price?
Yeah, so I think for city officials, the big shift to work from home has really increased the sensitivity of the local tax base. So residents in New York are going to be a lot more attuned to the quality of local governance, the quality of local public goods that are being provided to the people that live and work here. So the stakes are really high. So if you have a city that gets it right either by virtue of a great functioning political system or is just endowed with the kinds of amenities that people value, like here in Manhattan, those cities might be well positioned to benefit from work from home. But for the cities that don't get it right, due to a number of factors, whether they're economic or political reasons, some researchers worry that they may face a potential doom loop, right? A downward spiral where residents leave and inward commuters diminish. I think our reporting had shown that really the economic benefit of having these inward commuters into the city is incredibly important. And so there's this monumental task that policymakers are now faced with, and they're trying to work out how to best make this transition happen, which they anticipate is going to take years to achieve.
And what does it look like? What changes? Because there's a thing happening now in a lot of cities where politicians' answer to it is to try to force people to come back to work 5 days a week because that's what the system is set up for. But it doesn't seem realistic. A lot of workers are saying, well, why should I have to pay to sustain a system that no longer works for me? So change will have to come. What does it actually look like?
City officials right now are really trying to wrap their arms around possible solutions. Office conversions is one of them. As Emma mentioned, this is a very difficult undertaking. There's 10 million square footage that Mayor Adams thinks is something that could be repurposed to get people back into downtown so that they're not just there to go to the office, but they're living and going out to restaurants and helping support small businesses. the how-to is going to be really tough. And we don't really want to overdo the office conversions because you still need office buildings to be there as an economic engine of growth for the city. The one thing that I also want to add on to this, like with the rise of office vacancies, right? So because we have this like stark contrast from the old ebb of daytime population surges in the middle of the day, you end up having these declining office rents that reduce the value of commercial buildings and ultimately end up negatively impacting property revenue, which is such an important part of the city's livelihood. So some of the researchers at Columbia and NYU have modeled this 40% drop in office market value, which they're estimating could cost like $5 billion in annual lost tax revenue, or really 5% of the city's budget. That is a significant chunk. Having that 5% of the city's budget be eaten away because of office building depreciation, market value depreciation, really eats into the coffers of the city. But there's a big hole that will be left to be filled, right? That you need that additional tax revenue to fund schools, to fund the rat czar so that the streets are clean, pick up trash, policing, all of these things that are also at the crux of, what Eric Adams has to wrestle with in order to even create a feeling of economic recovery, right? That the city is back, that they don't have these ongoing issues.
For every different piece of the puzzle, there's perhaps a different solution. One thing we've heard from Sweetgreen is in these stores that have been really hard hit from this, they're actually trying to renegotiate their agreements with landlords so they can, instead of paying sort of fixed rent every month, maybe they can do it as a percentage of sales, for instance. With the MTA, with these big kind of budget gaps that they're facing down, they've said, unless we get some more money from, the city and state, we're going to need to cut service. And in fact, they are already cutting service on Mondays and Fridays. They're planning to on several lines that, largely connect Manhattan and other boroughs. There's a lot of emphasis by city leaders trying to inch your way back to what things looked like in 2019. And I think something we found really fascinating from this reporting is, might there be another path forward, for instance, by leaning into more of that outer borough silver lining that we're seeing? And so I think what's really interesting about kind of putting some numbers on this problem is it hopefully helps city officials, business leaders, everyone else find a way to take a path forward and create a better way for the city to recover.
Emma Court, Donna, Borak, thanks so much for coming on the show today.
Thank you so much, Wes.
It's been a pleasure.
When we come back, we'll talk about ways cities can reinvent themselves. So what are some of the things cities can do to meet all these changing needs and not go broke? Tracy Hadden Loh thinks about these questions for a living. She's a fellow at the Brookings Institution, and her research focuses on commercial real estate and how cities can become better places to work and live. And she joins me from Baltimore. Tracy, if employees won't come back 5 days a week, and it seems like in a lot of businesses where physical presence isn't required, that seems to be the new way of doing things. How are cities going to have to adapt? We have a lot of office buildings, which will no longer be needed. You have a lot of businesses that can't make as much money. So I guess what we're looking at down the road are cities changing, as they always do. What sort of changes do you see?
So a trend that was going on before the pandemic that has certainly been accelerated is that employers are consuming fewer square feet of office space per worker. That's been declining in the top 10 U.S. office markets for over a decade, and it's going to hit new lows now. And it's going to hit more markets. This is going to be everywhere in the U.S., not just in the biggest office markets. So the question there is, how low is it going to get? Because if your employees are in the office 3 days a week, you still need an office. The question is, how much obsolete office space is there? And that depends on how much employers can reduce their footprints. Relatively few employers are taking those footprints to zero and going fully remote. So the question is, what does the in-person component of a hybrid workplace look like? How much space does it take? And then of the remaining space, how much is now obsolete because it doesn't match these new demands for what offices have to be like, and how much of it can be adapted?
From a city planning perspective, when planning commissions and mayors and city councils start looking down the road at their cities, what sort of things are you hearing about the way they want downtowns to change? Not just office buildings, but restaurants and shops that depended on that 9 to 5 revenue that is now no longer as big as it used to be.
There's a few obvious things that cities are already doing and baking into their strategies that make sense. So the first is incentivizing the conversion of office into housing. So saying like, okay, you can strengthen demand for local retail, for example, by making sure that downtown is a place where people are not just between 9 and 5, but also 5 and 9. And you can also do that by increasing the quality of the other amenities that are in a downtown neighborhood, like waterfronts, other high quality open spaces, places just for people to spend time, whether they're working or doing something else, right? Since a majority of travel is non-work travel and a majority of the time in our lives is not spent at work, it makes sense that if you just want more people, then you need more non-work amenities and activities and experiences and things.
How hard will it be for cities to begin to adapt to this new reality?
So, Wes, what is holding up downtowns from adapting is that 90% of the built environment is controlled by the private sector. Individuals or companies who make their own decisions about their own assets. What cities can control is what's happening in the public right of way. And there are huge untapped opportunities in most cities to rethink that, not just in terms of high quality open spaces, but traffic safety, and to think about supporting retail, for example, by reallocating space from car storage and to retail. Like there's plenty of opportunities there that cities can take. But what about this 90% of the built environment that's controlled by the private sector? Figuring out how to incentivize the owners of these assets that are located at the heart of our cities, that is the big question right now of how to motivate these players to think differently about how they use their assets and put them to work. If we make adapting buildings really hard to do, people just won't do it and they'll just walk away. Like, there's always another option. What's going to happen with some of these office buildings is like there is going to be a wave of foreclosures. People are just going to give the keys back to the bank. And you know who's really going to do nothing with it? Banks.
Are there tax incentives? Are there other things that cities are already starting to offer to make those switchovers?
Yeah. Very few office buildings are 100% vacant. Even if they're half empty, that means they're also half full. So when you're talking about an office building, you're talking about an income producing asset that has current tenants in it. First off, the motivation is low for the owner to do anything with it because it is generating income. Maybe not as much as it used to, but if you wanted to do anything else with it, that would come with costs. So that's a disincentive to do anything different with it, especially when you do have some revenue. So in terms of incentivizing it, that means that the carrying cost of the vacant space has to increase. And the trick is increasing that carrying cost in a way that doesn't further disincentivize the owner from actually doing anything with it and investing in the property, doing something different with the property attractive. For example, Pittsburgh and Harrisburg in Pennsylvania both have a land value tax system in which they separately tax the land under a building and the building itself. So even if an office building is dwindling in value as it becomes more and more vacant, the land and the location remain valuable, and that increases the carrying cost of the asset because you can't escape the land tax.
I was speaking to a couple of my colleagues earlier about how all of this is playing out in New York City, which of course is, sort of the, center of attention a lot of the time whenever it comes to real estate. And in New York and other big cities, one of the huge complaints is no one can afford to live there. And so it's hard to live where you work. Do you see this as being an opportunity to change cities into places where people can actually afford to live and work?
So I don't think that converting offices into housing is going to make a meaningful dent in the housing crisis, because we are talking about a pretty small number of units relative to the need that is out there. What it can do is revitalize downtowns as places by bringing more people into them, and everyone should have that chance, not just the people with the most money. So in terms of policies and incentives that cities can offer in order to encourage the highest and best use of these locations, I think there's a strong argument to be made that incentivizing the production of housing, including affordable housing, and including housing for particular communities of concern that are concentrated downtown, like people experiencing homelessness, there's a clear case to take these underused real estate assets and serve a greater public good. So I think that we will see more policies incentivizing the production of housing and affordable housing in downtowns. And I think that there's a role for the federal government here too. Just like the federal government offers tax credits for the preservation of historic buildings, why not offer a tax credit for the recycling of buildings into affordable housing?
As someone who looks at especially commercial real estate and how that's changing all the time, look down the road for us in, 3 years, 5 years, in cities like Baltimore and New York, Chicago. What looks much different than it looks right now?
I mean, my greatest fear is that nothing looks different, and that cities enter a generation of decline because of the lack of dynamism in the real estate sector that prevents the built environment from adapting in a timely way. That is my greatest fear. My greatest hope is that we see a boom in population. We see all kinds of new housing downtown, that we see right-of-ways reimagined from being enormous channels for commuters into live, work, play spaces for people, and that we see office buildings incorporating some of the comforts of home with all of the important things that we need for work, like spaces to collaborate and incredible connectivity.
Tracy Hadden Loh, thanks so much for talking with me today.
Thanks, Wes.
You can read more from Emma Court and Donna Borak at Bloomberg.com. Thank you for listening to us here at The Big Take. It's a daily podcast from Bloomberg and iHeartRadio. For more shows from iHeartRadio, visit the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen. And we'd love to hear from you. Email us questions or comments to bigtake@bloomberg.net. The supervising producer of The Big Take is Vicky Vergolina. Our senior producer is Catherine Fink. Our producer is Rebecca Chasson, and our associate producer is Sam Gebauer. Raphael Amsili is our engineer. Our original music was composed by Leo Sidran. I'm Wes Kosova. We'll be back tomorrow with another Big Take.